Welcome to Positive Parenting Practices on behalf of Lee Summit Cares. My name is Carrie Gray, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist with 4 children of my own. I've also been teaching the Love and Logic parenting programs and other programs within the Kansas City community for 25 years. I hope that you will enjoy today's webinar on Peacekeepers Managing Conflict in Your Home. Today, our content will focus specifically on how to teach conflict resolution through role modeling and practice, how to communicate assertively so that your kids can learn how to communicate assertively, strategies to diffuse conflict, and finally, we'll wrap up with a 5-step guide for solving problems and a few additional resources. So let's start first by defining what conflict is. Conflict is a condition that presents itself when incompatible beliefs or goals are placed in opposition to one another. I think this cartoon does a nice job of illustrating how we might feel when we're engaged in a conflict. A person might say, "I'm not arguing, I'm explaining why I'm right," which is kind of funny, but not a good way to resolve a conflict. So what are some of the common sources of conflict? Certainly, a family can argue about where to go to dinner. Poor communication, we know, can create lots of conflict. Money management, balancing our work with our home obligations. For an older kid, it might be deciding on what time is an appropriate curfew or how much independence to give a child. Household chores, where to go on vacation, how to discipline children. As you can see, this list goes on and on. So learning how to deal with conflicts, which are inevitable in life, which are inevitable in relationships, is an important skill that we need to pass on to our children. So before we talk about solutions, let's talk about some common myths about conflict. The first myth is that conflict, if left alone, will take care of itself or even disappear on its own. This is simply not true. When we ignore conflict, it tends to fester and grow. Think about an elephant in the middle of the living room. Everyone knows it's there, yet no one's really talking about it. You can feel the emotional undertones when people who are experiencing conflict enter the same room. So pretending that a conflict will magically go away on its own is really not sustainable. A second myth is that conflict must be resolved and all conflicts can be resolved. This is simply not true. Think of politics as an example. Sometimes it's best just to agree to disagree. A third myth is that conflict always results in a winner and a loser. Certainly, based on your previous experience and growing up, conflict may not have been resolved always in the best way. And so as a result, people sometimes felt like they were a loser or that they were a winner. But today we're going to talk about appropriate ways to solve conflict where we remove the winner-loser scenario. And finally, conflicts must be resolved in one discussion. The truth is that some conflicts can be resolved in one discussion, such as where we're going to go to dinner, but many conflicts take place over a period of time. An example of that would be raising an adolescent who is seeking to have more independence and control over their choices, and a parent who is balancing how much control to give them and when to rein them in. So conflicts can also be a part of an ongoing conversation. So one place to start as we look at the ways in which we resolve conflicts is to look at some of the common scenarios. In this diagram on the left side, you're going to see a measure that says the importance of achieving the goal, whether that's low or high. And on the bottom, the measure is the importance of relationship from low to high. Now, naturally, when we're having a conflict, we're wanting to achieve whatever goal it is that we have. And there's different ways to go about doing that, but ways in which that also recognize the importance and the value of the relationship. So for example, if we start on the left side, A person who is highly focused on achieving their goal and isn't all that invested in the relationship might take more of a competing approach to resolving conflict. And this is where one party seeks to satisfy interest regardless of the impact on the other party. And so you might see this in different business relationships. Although when we look at this in terms of personal relationships, some would refer to this as more of a bullying approach to conflict management. Another example on the bottom would be to avoid the conflict altogether. And so that's where both parties seek to suppress the conflict, to ignore and try to pretend that it's not there. Neither of these strategies are sustainable for relationships and achieving goals long term. On the other side, though, we have an ideal situation where both parties are winning through collaboration. And so basically here, we're identifying what the main goal is that we're both wanting to achieve. And we're looking at how can we make this happen together, where we collaborate and share ideas and input, etc. Down below here, you can see accommodating, which would be the relationship. I care a lot about this person, and the importance of achieving my goal because I care so much isn't that high. Now, when we accommodate, when one party yields the win to the other party, sometimes we do that just because we love someone. But when we get into a pattern of constantly accommodating other people without considering our own needs, interests, desires, and goals, what happens is this creates kind of a resentment trap, which is really not good for your overall emotional health or your well-being. And so while we might accommodate from time to time because we love someone, we certainly don't want to find ourselves in a pattern of doing that. And right here, smack in the middle, is a compromise, where essentially both parties win because both parties are willing to give up and do something for the sake of the relationship and for each person achieving their specific goal. So what do we do now that we know different models for resolving conflicts or different approaches? When we have a conflict, it's important to know some diffusing techniques. And so this slide provides you with some basic ideas that we're going to go into a little bit deeper in the slides to come. The first concept here is that we should always address conflict when both parties are calm. Most of us are not able to think clearly when we're really angry or emotional, and that is because our brain isn't in a place where we can think clearly. And so simply by separating the kids who are fighting or removing yourself from the situation until you're able to calm down can help to provide some clarity and thinking so that when you go back to deal with the situation, you don't say or do something that you might later regret. The next part of diffusing techniques involves a practice called active listening. And we are going to get into this further and share some ideas from management guru Stephen Covey that he shares in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But when we listen first, it tends to help resolve conflicts better in the long run. And it also builds a positive relationship by saying, I care. I want to know where you're coming from and what you have to say. So listening is critical. Then we're going to move into the speaking part and how you can help lessen any defensiveness by using I statements instead of you statements. And finally, we know it's important to monitor our tone of voice and our body language because communication is more about our body tones and how we say things rather than actually the words that we use, even though those are somewhat certainly important as well. So we do need to focus on the whole picture when we are the speaker, when we're communicating, when we're listening. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the benefits of apologizing and how that builds relationships. So my question to you is, who does the most work? The person who is talking or the person who is listening? And the correct answer is the person who is listening. While it might take courage to have an uncomfortable conversation with someone, we know that there are many internal and external distractions that can make it very difficult to listen to another person. External distractions might include things like a cell phone, a computer, or even a person coming into the room and interrupting a conversation. While external, no, that was external, while internal type of disruptions or interference could include just being tired, being hungry, or maybe even thinking, here we go again, making assumptions about what the other person is going to say without actually taking the time to listen to that person. And finally, my most favorite one is, how can I really listen to you if I really don't want to hear what you have to say? And so you can see that there are many barriers to effective listening, and it's important to be aware of what those barriers could be so that you can plan for them. So let's focus first on the qualities of a good listener. Remember the phrase, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And that is a phrase that was coined by Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. A person who does a great job listening is someone who's able to be in the moment and focus all their attention on the other person. Now, what we find with kids, especially as they get older and move into adolescence, is that it's less threatening to have a conversation about an important topic when our kids are doing an activity that they enjoy. And so depending on your child, you might go and shoot some baskets, out in the yard and talk about how things are going. Or I have 4 girls and I might take them to the nail salon or go for a walk with the dog and with them and just talk about how things are going. But we do find it is a little less intimidating to do the discussion when doing something that the kid enjoys. Another thing that's important is to use empathy to validate the person's feelings. And this is something that is incredibly critical and something that our world needs so desperately. And that is the ability to put ourselves in another person's shoes and to imagine what it would be like to be in that person's situation. It's important that we just focusing on validating feelings, even if we think the person is totally overreacting to the situation, or we think, wow, this is really not that big of a deal. When we say a person shouldn't be feeling a certain way, we try to suppress their feelings, which is not something that is a positive message about the relationship. And it also doesn't allow that person to move forward. We need to allow the person to label what it is that they're feeling so that they can move on to what are we going to do about it. So as you're listening, then the third piece is to paraphrase or summarize what you've heard. And so here's an example that I give. It says, I hear you saying that you're tired of watching your brother. All right. So maybe it's a teenager who's been given on more responsibility in that area. So identifying exactly what that person is saying is a way of acknowledging their feelings and acknowledging their needs as well as their wants. It doesn't mean that we necessarily agree or disagree with the person. It's just saying, hey, I care about our relationship. I want to know what you're needing. And then finally, the last piece is to confirm your understanding. And so this is where we start to bring things into a solution focused. And that would be, it sounds like you would like more time to do things that you want to do without your brother. So in that situation, looking for some more free time. So there we go. That's how we can start focusing on solutions and solving that problem and making it comfortable for our kids to come to us when they're dealing with some type of conflict, knowing that we will seek first to listen, that we will validate their feelings, that we will summarize to make sure that we're catching it correctly, and that will help them to focus on what they would like to see happen in the future. So when we talk about the speaker role, we have to discuss what assertive communication is. And so essentially what that means is that we're standing up for our personal rights and expressing our thoughts, feelings, and beliefs in a direct, honest, and appropriate ways. Communicating what you think and how you see a situation. And also expressing your rights without validating the rights of others. So let's look at this a little bit more specifically. Everyone has assertive rights, and this is not an inclusive list, but here are some ideas to get you thinking as you're communicating. You have the right to have your needs met and to be as important as those around you. You also have the right for your opinions to be respected and considered. You have the right to make requests of others. You have the right to manage your own time, which means it's okay for you to say, no, I can't do that. You also have a right to make mistakes, and believe me, we all make many. And you have the right to ask for clarification and not make assumptions. So keep these things in mind as we move forward and talk about how we're going to communicate what our feelings and what our needs are. So as we look at this, I'm sure in any communication materials, you have already heard the importance of using the I statement versus the you statement. And we want to do that for many reasons. One is because we're owning our own feelings and expressing what our own needs are. But also, when we focus on I instead of you, we avoid putting someone into a defensive position. So you can see through these examples here what I mean by that. So the first example is an I message. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I need help with the laundry. As opposed to, you hardly do anything around here. Go fold the clothes. All right. So you can tell if you were being spoken to in this way, the person who's saying you don't do anything around here is probably going to get a little bit defensive, even if it's true. Here's a second example. I feel frustrated when I'm on a business call and you keep interrupting me. I need you to wait patiently until I'm finished. As opposed to, you are so inconsiderate. If you can't stop interrupting me, we're not going for a bike ride. All right. So essentially, through both of these statements, the goal is the same. You know, in the first one, I need some help with the laundry. That's the goal. The key is how you say it. And we want to say it in a way where it's easier for the person to listen to what we're saying. So focus on those I statements rather than you statements. Another powerful tool in diffusing conflict is to apologize. And by apologizing, we're essentially showing respect and empathy for the person who we've wronged. And let's face it, kids do not come with an instruction manual. For those of you who have more than one child, like I said, I have 4, you know that their personalities and what makes them tick and what motivates them is very different. And so what might work on one may not work on the other. And so there's a lot of trial and error that goes around. Naturally, we're going to make mistakes. And it's very empowering for our kids when we acknowledge, hey, I realize that I shouldn't have done that or made that assumption. I apologized. All right. So that does a few things. One is it builds our relationship, that relationship of trust with our kids. It liberates us from knowing that, you know, we made a mistake. So we can let that go. We're going to apologize. We're going to move on with that. But the third thing is that it helps our kids to be able to apologize themselves when they make that inevitable mistake in their relationships. The other thing is it disarms that anger so that we can move forward. And like I said, it builds relationships, and it's a great way to role model how to solve conflict with your kids. Finally, I have 2 more pieces as we wrap up. And the first is a 5-step problem-solving guide that was created by the Love and Logic Institute. And so what Love and Logic says is whenever there is a conflict or a problem, that's important that we always respond first with empathy rather than anger and frustration. So let's say that you have two kids, they're teenagers, they're both of driving age, but you only have one car. And so they're upset because they both need the car to do something. So as a parent, we would respond with empathy. Oh man, I can see where that's going to be a big problem, that you both need to get an errand done and there's only one car. How frustrating. Then step two is to give them the power message of ownership. What are you going to do about it? This communicates that you are releasing that problem to them because they're smart enough to come up with some type of solution. But sometimes they need a little bit of help along the way, and that's where step three comes in. Would you like to hear what others have tried? Now, if they're too angry and upset and they're still fighting, they're not going to be ready for this, so they might have to be separated, as we mentioned earlier. But if they're up to listening to ideas, then what we can do is provide them with a few simple ideas to get them thinking. And I always like to start with one that's not so great, just so that they get their control needs met by being able to say no to something. So I might say, well, some sisters decide to just give the keys over to the other sister and wait and not do their errand today. And chances are they're going to say, well, I can't do that. I have to get this done today. Oh, okay, so that won't work. Well, some kids decide to go and run their errands together. How would that work? And some kids might respond, well, I don't want to be around so-and-so, right? Well, here's one other idea I have. Some kids decide to create a schedule with the car and plan in advance so that you know who has the car and when they have the car so that you don't run into these problems again. At this point, they might just roll their eyes at you. So the key here is that you don't have to give an abundance of solutions. You just need to give a few ideas to get them started and to have them evaluate, well, what would the consequence of any of those choices be? Then we wrap up by saying, hey, I know you guys are smart enough to figure this out. Good luck. And we just empower them to solve the problem. So that's one example of how they can resolve that conflict. Another example is something that many elementary schools classrooms have posted within their schools, but if you look closer at this, you're going to see that these suggestions for problem solving could be used with anyone of any age. And so, like we said earlier, one option would be to wait and cool off before we have the discussion. We might have to go to another game or do something else. We might need to sit down and talk it out when we're feeling calm, and that would start first with listening. We might have to share or take turns, like with the car. And maybe it's a comment that it's just best for us to ignore it because maybe that sibling is trying to get a response from us. And so by simply ignoring it and walking away, they don't get the response they want. Sometimes we have to be more assertive and say, stop, I don't like it when you do that. And of course, we talked about apologizing and the idea of compromise, because oftentimes we will need to compromise because we can't only get what we're wanting out of a situation. So essentially, I want to thank you for listening today. The bottom line is that conflict is a part of life. And when we teach our kids how to manage and deal with conflict, we're equipping them with some very important life skills that they will use not only within their personal life, but also in their professional life. So I hope that you will continue to visit Lee's Summit Cares to learn more about upcoming webinars, as well as classes that we offer in person. Have a great day.